everyone, and welcome to the panel on VC. I'm Amy Lewin. I'm the editor of Sifted. If you don't know about Sifted, we write about startups and tech in Europe. Please sign up to our newsletters, check out our jobs. If you want to work for the leading startup publication in Europe, please check us out. But you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to these folks. So I have Juliet Bailin, who is a partner at General Catalyst in London in their new-ish office, because she's part of the whole troop of Americans coming over to get involved in the European startup scene, which we'll be talking about plenty. And I have Matt Clifford, who is the co-founder of EF, how do we call it? It's not quite
talent investor, Amy.
Talent investor. There we go. So I'm sure many of you will have looked into EF and maybe applying in the future. So we'll be chatting a bit about that. If you have any questions, please just ask them throughout, and I will do my best to keep an eye on the comments and just ask them as and when they are relevant. So to get started, Juliet, make the case for starting a company in Europe right now. Why is this the moment?
So I moved out here in 2018, and when I did, I think coming from New York, there was just a lot of conversation about, could you start a really big company out here? Could you actually do that? And there was a lot of arrogance. And the reality is, not only can you start a company out here, it can be extraordinary and it can be global. And what people don't remember is that there are more software engineers out here in Europe than there are in the US. So when you think about talent, that's extraordinary. And further education is much more common in Europe. I'm talking master's and PhD programs, which means that the IP developed out here is far more innovative, just statistically on average. And so the only thing we're missing is for folks to get started. And if capital was ever a question, folks who haven't saved a ridiculous amount of money, which no one would expect you to at any age, to go and start a company and then raise once you have something, you don't have to do that anymore. There are plenty of folks like me, and you could go to Entrepreneur First and actually have some cash coming in the door and start something yourself. So, I mean, there's never been a better time to be a founder, and that's a separate question around markets, but I would do it in Europe in a heartbeat.
All right, Matt, make the case not to do it. Why should just
not to do it at all?
No one put themselves through the founder journey. Let's be honest. Come on.
100%. Most people shouldn't be founders, full stop. Most people shouldn't be founders. There is so much evidence that on average, founders make less money than employees. They are more stressed and generally just have worse life outcomes on nearly every metric. Of course, the thing is, that is the case of the median founder. So if you think you're going to be the median founder, you should absolutely, definitely 100% not start a company. Please don't apply to Entrepreneur First. Please don't ask Juliet for money. The median founder should go get a job. But this is a little bit like saying not everyone should be a doctor. It's true, but we'd be pretty screwed if we didn't have any doctors. So the great thing about founders, especially successful ones, is that they're, the joke we have internally is that they're rationally over-optimistic. In other words, if you think you're going to be the median, you shouldn't do it. But of course, we want to select 4 people who think that they'll be extraordinarily great at it. Unfortunately, some of you will still be wrong, but as long as you come into it with the knowing what you're getting into and understanding the trade-offs, I think for a certain type of person, it's without parallel as a way of having a limitless, uncapped career. But 100%, Amy, with you, it's not for everyone.
All right. So now for the people listening who are like, I could definitely hack it. Juliet, what are some of the characteristics or things you might enjoy or not enjoy that maybe mean you could have it?
Things that someone would enjoy if they become a founder, or things that I would look for in a great one?
Things that you would look for.
Number one, bar none. And to be fair, I do almost all early stage investing. So for the folks in the panel, that's like pre-seed to Series A, even though those rounds are these days just words. Bar none, number one is, do you attract extraordinary people to work with you? Because you couldn't possibly know everything, and you certainly won't be able to do everything. So can you get other extraordinary people who are fantastic at some specific thing, be that engineering or talent or product or what have you, to go and work with you, to drop their jobs and their salaries and take equity in your company with the hopes of it being worth 20 times more in however many years. That I look for, bar none.
Okay. And what, Matt, can you talk me through, have you seen this in action? Like, what is it that those founders who are really good at like drawing the people in, how do they do it? Is it just like the usual, they have a really great mission?
No, I think mission helps. I think like we are, probably if you're watching this panel, you're in the very fortunate position to have, a university education in a kind of by global standards rich country. And so you've kind of already won the lottery of life. Like it's very unlikely, it's not sadly impossible that you're going to end up, kind of destitute. 99.9% of you will have simply by the luck of being where you are today, like great careers where you make enough money to pay the rent and eat and hopefully also have, kind of some of the luxuries of life as well. And so I do think mission is super important because in a world where like for most of us, fortunate enough to be here at least, sort of material, kind of prosperity, like making sure that we can survive isn't the concern anymore. I think mission and purpose and like finding meaning in our work, which, for most of us will be a big part of the number of hours we live, will be work. I do think mission really, really matters. The problem with that, as I think you're sort of hinting at least in your tone of voice, is that every company under the sun has a mission today. Like you can be doing the world's dullest, most like pure play arbitrage thing, and yet there'll be some mission about providing liquidity to markets or something. And it's, I don't know if I'm allowed to say bullshit on this show, but it's obviously total bullshit. I think where you get what I would call founder mission fit, where there's something about the founder's story, about their background, either something they've experienced or, a passion, a thread they've pulled on, that means that the mission really rings true for that founder. I think that can be like truly, truly infectious in a way that is just goes beyond all the kind of crap that everyone writes on their websites. I've been fortunate to work with quite a lot of founders like that. I'm sure Juliet has too. And when it really clicks and it's not, they haven't had to go on a 2-day whiteboarding boot camp with a design agency to come up with a mission statement. In fact, it was just like so obvious to them, so inherent in who they are and what they've done. Then I think that can be really magic. And then I think attracting talent, I don't want to say it ever becomes easy. I mean, there is so much demand for talent today, but it certainly makes it a lot easier than if it's like, hey, you might get rich 10 years from now, which is, Juliet's already hinted at, is like, that everyone is saying that.
Yeah. For anyone who is thinking, hey, I'll go into entrepreneurship, I'll be making a mint straight away. Can you dispel some of those myths? Just how little do founders that you often see at like pre-seed, seed, how much are they actually making, if anything?
Well, we like to joke that the founder salary is the residual. In other words, like you have a fixed amount of money. Usually you've raised a fixed amount of money. It has to last you, sadly, not a fixed length of time. It has to last you until you've achieved enough that you can convince someone like Juliet that, you have de-risked the company or proven out one of the core hypotheses in some way. And there's some things that don't flex. It's pretty hard to go to your landlord and say, hey, actually getting to product market fit is proving a little slower than we thought. Presumably we can have a discount. Or to your team, hey, thanks, what you signed up for is X, but how about 0.75X? I mean, you can have that conversation, but it's tough. And so the founder often is thinking in a very direct way. Every pound, euro, dollar I pay myself is a pound, euro, dollar that isn't going into the runway of the company. Now, of course, founders should pay themselves. And fortunately, in today's market, kind of VCs, I think, would very strongly say it is very important that the founder is not wondering, how do I make ends meet when I'm trying to build this business? So I think the days of literally, kind of ramen in basements with, no electricity, I think they're long gone if they ever existed. But I don't know what you see, Julia. I mean, we see a real range, I have to say. I think sort of pre-seed people paying themselves, often as little as 25 to 35, £1,000 a year. I think by the time people are raised to Series A, it's quite common for people to be paying themselves, anywhere between sort of 70 and 100 and low 100 and something £1,000, which is obviously a really great salary. But often for the people involved, their opportunity cost is actually way higher than that.
Way higher. Yeah. We see the exact same. And I've seen some founders get away by paying everyone in the company the same salary for the first 2 years, which is a great thing to do for camaraderie, but to your point, can make hiring some extraordinary person who could otherwise get an easy job at Google really hard. Although that's not necessarily the person you want to hire if they're used to a cushier lifestyle. So it is an enormous range. I think there's an important distinction to make, that founders assume that their investors want you to protect the company. And so they do whatever, by whatever means, protecting the company. So they'll eat ramen, or they won't sleep very much, or they'll, work 7 days a week nonstop for months. But actually, as investors, especially the early stage, you are the company, the founders. And so if you're not taking care of yourself and eating 3 meals a day, or sleeping, 6 to 8 hours, depending on what works for you, like, you're actually not taking care of the company in our minds. And it's a weird thing for founders to wrap their brains around, but actually self-care is enormously important. And this is a marathon. You're not sprinting, for 2 weeks. You're building a company for the next 10 years. So it has to be sustainable.
Maybe just one thing I would add on that very briefly is that one useful way I think of thinking about money in lots of different contexts, when you're running a startup, is that the most important thing is alignment. If you're the founder or CEO of a company, you have a whole series of stakeholders: your team, your customers, your investors, obviously you and your co-founder if you have one, and all of you have slightly different interests. And so one of the most important things, I think, is to try and think about what are the mechanisms that you can create in order to ensure alignment. In other words, I do well if you do well. And startups, I think, start with a head start in a lot of ways. The fact that most employees in a startup get equity. And if you are a founder, I would strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to make sure that your employees get equity. It creates alignment. And so, building on Juliet's point about how do investors think about their early stage companies, there's a real alignment in wanting the founders to thrive and do well. Now, I think when I gave that sort of salary range, the one thing I'd want to emphasize is, if you're getting into a startup because you think, wow, I could get to the top end of that salary range and that's really good money, that's just not a very aligned way of thinking. Like, the reason startups sometimes pay their founders that much is if they've come down from a much higher salary in a big corporate job or whatever. And so, like, really your alignment comes from equity. It doesn't come from being like, yeah, I'm going to make it to the point where my salary is what makes me rich. I think that's just the wrong mindset altogether about thinking about how you're creating value. And really, the alignment comes from saying we're going to own something collectively, which is going to become super valuable. The salary is the short-term mechanism to make sure I can pay the rent and don't worry about money, but it's not how you get rich.
On the point about alignment and then co-founders, is it just best if all the co-founders own an equal amount of the company, or are there situations where it does work okay if someone has more at the start? And what would be the reasons that it would be okay that one of the co-founders owns more of the company than there maybe one or two other co-founders?
It's not a hard and fast rule, is the reality. And so I've invested in companies where one founder sometimes has significantly more, sometimes has just a bit more. Oftentimes that's the person who started the business in the first place, had the idea, registered the company, started building, and then maybe found a co-founder afterwards, maybe a co-founder to help with build business or operations, or a co-founder had industry expertise they didn't have, or a co-founder who was technical if they weren't. So there's a clear distinction in time that one person started the business and the other joined, yes, early and as a co-founder, but wasn't there at the origin point. But if two people get together and have an idea together, trying to decide who will be more valuable to the business and thus deserves more equity is a fool's errand. You have no idea. And as the company grows, there are going to be different days or weeks where one of you is way more important than the other. Or if there are three of you, same thing. So if you're starting a company with humans in the same moment and registering that business together, and there's no question of that, I would be hard pressed to make the argument for why it shouldn't be equal.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with that. I mean, we've helped literally thousands of people find co-founders and start companies from scratch at Entrepreneur First. And I think equality of equity is such a powerful default starting point that the bar to changing that needs to be so high. And just to amplify that last point that Juliet made, the problem is equity is often thought of by the co-founders at the start as almost like backward looking, like whose idea was it? And like who's done what so far? But if you think about it from what equity is, which is a claim on the future value of the company, nearly all that value is coming in the future. And so, one of the ways we frame it to people who join us at EF is, if you're saying you want to start a company with this person, but you're so unsure about the value that they'll add that you're not willing to give them half of it on day one, probably they're not the right person to start the company with. It's true that for a successful founder, giving their co-founder half the company is the most expensive decision you'll ever make in your life. But if it doesn't also feel like the best value decision that you're making, pick a different co-founder where you do feel like that. It's almost a good test. Like I wouldn't start a company with someone who I didn't feel comfortable having half the equity.
All right. So give me some examples, Matt. You must have seen a lot of fairly disastrous co-founder relationships. And what was it about that was not great?
I assume you don't mean names, Amy. I mean, I know I'm all for transparency.
We're going to keep this one anonymous as a kind of lesson for anyone listening.
I mean, I think there are three big causes of co-founder failures, at least as we see failures of co-founding teams. The first is misaligned values and vision. Like, sort of feels like you're sort of building the same thing. Like, oh, we're both interested in education. Like that is like the level of like alignment you need around what you're trying to build just has to be so high. The amount of frustration that you'll build in a co-founding relationship if you don't have that is just extraordinarily painful and should be avoided. So that's the first thing. Just like make sure you're super, super aligned on what you're actually trying to build. The second is sort of, I think it almost goes back a little bit to the last sort of bit of the conversation about sort of lifestyle. It sounds really trivial, but like I've seen a lot of founders fall out over working hours. Like, like I don't need to, I'm a bit more experienced than you. I don't need to work 12-hour days to kind of contribute as much. So I'm going to be, coming by the office at sort of 10 or whatever. And when I say it's about working hours, I don't think that's the root cause. That is the like symptom of a deeper cause, which is not a lack of total respect between the two. Respect for your co-founder is just is probably the most important thing. Like if you don't kind of feel that you're sort of getting away with something and that you're really lucky that you get to work with them, and if they don't sort of feel the same secretly, I think that's really hard. I think you've both got to feel like the other is just the most amazing person. I think the third is which is a bit more painful. It's just about performance. I think that sometimes you just hit a point where the company needs something of its founders and one of the founders can't do it or isn't performing at a level that is going to give the company what it needs. And that's the most painful one, because I think for the first two, they're sort of things you can detect quite quickly by having the right conversation at the start. And a lot of what we do at EF is help people have those conversations so that they front load the breakup rather than once you've raised some money and got people working for you. But the performance thing is really hard. And I mean, you said disastrous. What I would sort of argue, though, slightly against myself, is you can work with this. One of the interesting things that people don't talk about enough is not everyone who starts the journey, and this is obviously true for employees, but I feel it's true of co-founders too, needs to be on the journey the whole way through. Like some people have a very strong preference for the first 0 to 50 employees. And that's what they're really good at, and they should double down on that. Others want to go all the way to IPO. And I think we're sometimes as an ecosystem maybe not honest enough about the value of people who can contribute a huge amount in the first 3 years and then sort of tap out. They can't do what's needed after that. And so I think having that conversation early on as well and trying to figure out, like, what are you actually excited about here? Is it the mission all the way to the end, or is it getting off the starting blocks? Again, I don't think that we should see one as right and the other as wrong, but when that's misaligned, really painful.
Smart. How do you both feel about backing founders who are fresh out of university?
Done it many times. Done it many, many times. I would say the most successful founders GCs backed are either first time or second time founders for whom their first startup was not particularly successful, because you learn an enormous amount from failure. we really try not to, well, I think there are two things. One, age is not necessarily an indicator of maturity. I've worked with founders who are significantly older, have a decade of experience and struggle dealing with conflict and pressure. And so I wouldn't say the opposite is true, that if you're coming right out of university, that you're not mature, don't have, thoughtful ways of thinking about the world and understand the magnitude of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, but you'll have never had like a proper job before.
Totally.
Right? Like, that must be throw up some challenges.
Oh yeah. And you need to be very comfortable asking questions, like very comfortable with a lot of people telling you things you've never thought of before. And that requires a level of, yes, maturity is an easy way of putting it, but just being very self-assured, and surrounding yourself with people you trust, who, when they say like, you can't do that in this particular type of setting, or you can't speak this way to such and such, or whatever, that you say, oh, I didn't know, and not, well, maybe I can. So yeah, there's a lot of trust with the humans you surround yourself with. The other piece, though, is if we're investing in the world that will exist in 10, 20 years from now, how could we possibly not listen to people who are younger, who are experiencing the world in a completely different way than we are? One of our partners, Nico Bonsantos, who does a lot of our seed investing, spends at least 50% of his time with Gen Z founders, minimum, simply because we'll miss a dozen innovative businesses at least a year if we don't spend the time. So we try really hard not to be too biased.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Does he have kind of extra questions or extra things he's like probing into with such young founders?
I think all of us do. I'm trying to think of good example questions. Asking people this is such a boring question, but what they think they're really good at and what they think they're going to be really bad at. Or if this doesn't work out in 5 years, what will have gone wrong? Just to have, not that they're going to be right. Predicting the future is impossible, but just to get a sense for how they think.
Mm-hmm.
And I always ask founders to ask me questions and see what types of questions they ask. That's a great way.
What are the kind of questions founders might ask you that would make you go either like, no way, or like, aha, I think we have a genius in our midst?
Yeah, if they start asking immediately about the next funding round, like, oh, well, what will it be like when we raise our Series A? It's like, you haven't built anything yet. That's a good indicator that maybe you're not quite ready for what seed to Series A is, where most failure happens. So maybe you're not quite ready. When founders say, oh yeah, I'm mostly going to hire my friends. I don't think it makes sense to hire someone older than me. That's a little nerve-wracking, right? You have to be very comfortable with people who are way more experienced than you working for you. And I love when founders ask if they can get a coach. When they say, is that something GC is supportive of? Oh man, every day. Love that idea, because it just means they're open to learning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of other bad ones. Matt, have you ever?
I think like the one. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, on the working with older people thing, I think that's super interesting. And I'm not Gen Z, but I'm not that old, and that's like a challenge I have as well.
Yeah.
How have you seen like Gen Z founders do that well? Like hire someone into their C-suite who's like old enough to be their parent and not make that relationship weird.
There are a lot of ways you can do it. One is, ensuring you have a group around you that by having them around you sort of affords you credibility. So if you have really thoughtful advisors and serious investors, then if somebody comes in and it's like, I'm about to work for a 22-year-old and they're 45 or 50, they're like, okay, but if these serious people have decided to spend time with you, then that's sort of an initial gating factor that can help. And getting serious people to interview that person on your behalf, because it demonstrates that you understand you wouldn't necessarily be the right person to make the call on who your CRO should be if you've never had one before. And the other thing is just spending genuine, thoughtful time with the person and articulating whatever your genius is, whatever your insight is that is fundamentally different. Being able to share that authentically with somebody can be very inspiring for an older person in their career who doesn't necessarily have those types of ideas anymore and sees it in you. And they think that they can help you build a really big company around this fascinating idea that they could never possibly have come across. So there are many ways that you can create credibility, but also associate yourself with it.
It's that difficult mix of like, I think 5 of the 6 most valuable EF companies were started by people with less than 2 years of work experience. And when I think about those 5 people in particular, what really stands out for me is these are learning machines. Like all they want to do is learn. Like the question, to Juliet's point, like the question they would be asking the investor is like something laser focused on something they need or want to understand right now for their business. And you can tell that they're not trying to signal anything. They're not trying to look smart. They're not trying to repeat something they read in a Hacker News comment or a blog post or a Mark Andreessen tweet. They're like independent thinkers who just want to like suck up knowledge. And I think when you see that in someone, I feel I am getting old now. And like when I started EF 11 years ago, I was, like roughly the same age as the founders we backed. And now I'm almost always older than the founders we back. And, like when I see like a sort of fresh grad or similar, that sort of age founder who just wants to learn, it's just really inspiring. Like I think very often I'm like, wow, I could totally work for this person. And, I think if you can combine that humility with that confidence, the sort of, I know I've got something special here and it can be big, but I also know that I don't know everything I need to know in order to get it done. That's a very attractive combination to get behind. And I think that's the common thread I see, at least in our like younger founders.
I've always found this a bit interesting. Can you just be like, I want to be a founder, and like that's good enough to go on? Like I'm an entrepreneurial type, I just need to find the thing. Or do you think the thing needs to come to you and then you really want to go and like create that idea, that company? Or do you think it doesn't really matter? Matt, I'm guessing you're more on the you can just want to build something side?
Sort of. I think a lot of people think that about EF, but it's not really true. We have a really important framework that we use at Entrepreneur First when people join us, which is about finding your edge, where edge means in the sense of like a personal competitive advantage. And what we say to people is very unlikely that you're going to just decide you want to be a founder, start with a blank sheet of paper, and somehow come up with an idea that is going to be both valuable, well-targeted, and scalable. It's just very unlikely. And so we do think that, for a lot of people, they've probably been in environments that have made it really hard for them to have time and space to hone in on a great idea for them. So we're not too worried if people join us without an idea that would pass muster from, through a traditional VC or investment lens. But we do worry a lot about people who want to be a founder for the sake of being a founder. I think that very rarely works out. If you don't have anything that you're bringing to the table in terms of like where you want to focus, the kinds of problems that you're interested in solving, the kinds of tools that you're interested in using to solve a problem, I think it's very difficult. So I think you can have a generalized, you can definitely have a view that starting a company is a great vehicle for realizing your ambitions. But if there's no content to that at all beyond that, we would tend to be pretty suspicious.
Juliet?
So I think it's rare that I've met a founder who just says, I just want to start a company. But I have met founders who, when you ask why they chose to start this particular business, they say, I really just wanted to start a company. And so I went and spoke to 400 people doing different things and then came to this idea. And that's how I met my co-founder, et cetera. So I'm actually on the side that sometimes that desire to go through the founder experience can be very motivating, especially because to be a founder is so hard that if you genuinely just want to start a company because you think that would be an amazing and motivating experience for you, that can be really impactful. Now, again, to Matt's point, we don't necessarily invest in someone who just goes, I'm going to do it. Sometimes that happens for second-time founders when they're like, I've done it before, I'm definitely going to do it again. I'm not really sure what. You'll see a lot of angel investors throw money at people like that because they'll probably find something interesting, or just given their networks, they'll come across a great co-founder who has a really interesting idea just by virtue of their background. But if it's a first-time founder, sometimes when you ask, why did you start this? Which I ask everybody, regardless of stage, they say, I really wanted to do this. And then I went and, did my work. and found this person or found this idea. And then I did even more work and I had another 100 conversations. And this is the insight we came up. And then we threw that away and we pivoted. We got here and now I'm bringing this to you.
That's so important because I think people really underestimate. If you've never started a company before, one of the things you're, in my experience, likely to underestimate is how much the act of getting started will change both you and your thinking and ideas. And so like, I definitely think that the opposite point that like that the idea needs to be like super well formed at the beginning. I mean, it's impossible. I think a lot of the way that less the media, but more like popular culture covers founders makes founder journey seem inevitable. It's like, right. Well, one day like Steve Jobs had this idea and therefore, like Apple. In my experience, it's absolutely nothing like that. Like like almost like your abilities and interests as a founder are procedurally generated by the act of getting started. And so one of the consequences of that, if you believe that, is that you can't be too analytical about these things. I don't think you can sit down one day and be like, right, I'm going to like do a cost benefit analysis of whether I should be a founder. Like, you don't know. Like
you'd never start a company if you ran that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Are there any areas where you are like, I never, ever, 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 ever want to see a pitch deck from a company in this space ever again? Like, what is just feeling very overdone right now? Because we get this from the journalist side, right? You get these phases of like 500 pitches a week for like some sort of, at the moment it's HR, tech.
I was just thinking that, but
having a moment.
with about 1 million caveats though, it's tough, right? So yes. There is definitely a lot of stuff. I mean, we're seeing a ton of e-commerce tooling. We're seeing a ton of inventory management software. The reality is with these areas that are noisy, you could build a better product. Absolutely. You could build the best product, best in class, solves the problem better than anyone. The issue is if there are a lot of companies that say they do what you do, even if they don't do it, your customer base is deluged with options, and their ability to differentiate between solutions and eventually choose the best one is actually really hard for them, for a customer. So from that perspective, I think we lost Amy.
I think we did, but we can probably keep going. The show must go on. I was just going to say, Juliet, it's so interesting to hear you say that because I guess we see the same, but at like even earlier, right? When people are just sort of we see like almost talent flows into like categories, and one of the things that I'm always struck by is our bar for becoming cynical is quite low. You're like, oh man, I've seen so many of them. But I almost think maybe the true contrarian take is that is exactly when something really huge in one of those spaces will get built.
Totally. We just had this conversation around productivity tooling.
Right.
We love productivity tooling. We talk about it all the time. It's a ubiquitous problem, right?
Right.
And you've got the Asanas and you've got the Mondays.com. You've got all these big companies that have created these bars and they're supposed to help you, whatever. And yet we're still not enormously productive. We still spend our time on email. So maybe there is something, but you see the first grains of those products. You see the to-do list and you think, I've seen 100 of these, but that's still an unsolved problem.
And maybe in general, like we overestimate, or like the sort of popular portrayal of startups overestimates the value of newness in the, Google was the 15th search engine. Facebook was the 29th social network. In some ways, it's sort of just when it feels overdone that maybe the category is getting ready to dominate. I think one thing that I definitely feel very strongly is that there's good reasons why these are overly busy markets, because getting into a good market is so much more important than almost any other decision that you make as a company. And so despite all those problems of can the customers actually differentiate good from bad? It feels like it's not totally irrational that founders get so excited about these spaces. I'm back. Amy, we tried to take a contrarian view. We tried to live up to your...
It was great. You clearly carried on seamlessly. You don't really need me. So my next question, why should these people here, these good people, why should they start a company in Europe, not the US? And are there any kinds of companies that actually, you know what, they should start them in the US?
I mean, my view on this. I mean, Julia made a great, in the opening answer. I mean, there's lots of amazing things about Europe today. I won't repeat them, around the software engineering and IP, etc. I would sort of argue that geography has never been less important in starting a company. And actually, we now have funded a bunch of companies where I don't even know whether I should call them European companies. I mean, like, yeah, the founders are sometimes here, but the team is all over the world.
Yeah.
Particularly in the Web3 space, I get investor updates from teams where like they list the team members and half of them are pseudonymous. I don't know where they are. Like, and they certainly don't work in a physical office with the founders. And I think obviously the pandemic has been this like horrific thing for the world. But if we're looking for silver linings, I think one of the things it has done is really taken down a lot of the geographic boundaries in our industry. I mean, it's not that long ago that the idea that General Catalyst or Sequoia or Lightspeed would open an office in Europe would have been like totally ludicrous. I remember sort of going to like pitch a bunch of Sand Hill Road investors as recently as sort of 2016, 17 and getting a sort of like, that's so lovely that you're doing that. How cute. Like that was the general view of Europe. Now, you take, an investor like Y Combinator, particularly through the pandemic being fully remote, everyone incorporates in Delaware, but I bet a lot of the investors that follow them have no idea where the founders are. Like, so I would say like, you should start the company where it makes sense for you as the founder to be. And I think beyond that, it's becoming more and more that, actually the world is getting flatter. It's not perfectly flat. There are definitely caveats we could add to that. But I suppose my immediate response is that, it really is the golden age of, sort of geographic mobility when it comes to startups.
All right. If that's the case, Juliet, why did General Catalyst bother to open a physical office
here? No, it's great. I get asked this all the time. And the funny thing is
stacked biscuits.
Right. So the thing is, GC, it's kind of misleading that we started in Europe last year because GC already had 35 portfolio companies in Europe and in Israel when we did. So it was a long time coming. And one of our partners, Adam Balkan, had been an investor out here for over a decade. And he was a partner at Excel. And so we had a lot of connectivity in Europe already. But the reason we opened the physical space, right, that it wasn't that we were just going to be investing from afar is GC's origins are in early stage investing. Most of the companies we're known for are investments we made very early on, like a Stripe or a Samsara, Livongo, or Kayak.com. Some of those are even incubations. And then we just invested as they grew over the course of their experience. And a lot of the investments we had made out in Europe when we did not have an office here were growth stage investments, Series Bs and Cs and Ds, where to Matt's point, even then, people are starting to expand internationally. They're opening in the US. It's a more mature team, a more professional business. So you can support them as an investor from far away. It's easy to do it at your quarterly board meeting, the occasional phone call. If you're starting a pre-seed, seed, Series A company, I live on WhatsApp with my founders. And they shouldn't ever have to wake up in the morning and wait 8 hours for me to wake up. So frankly, it was just a case of if we're going to do what we're known for, what our LPs know us for, what we think we're quite good at, we have to be here. We just have to be around. So that was the impetus for us. And it's not the same for every firm. I know some firms did not have a long track record in Europe, but saw the economic opportunities, saw some arbitrage given how high prices have been in the US, wanted to be closer to Israel because they had a big Israeli portfolio. I mean, there are a dozen reasons why you do it. But I think for us, it was to do what GC does, you have to be physically available.
How many more American VC firms are we going to see opening physical offices in Europe this year?
7.
But that's so specific. Wow. My God. Should I go make a bet?
You'll get a prize at Christmas. One of
us gets our
closest.
Do I do the over-under on 7 or?
I want a precise number, Julia, and it can't be 7.
Starts a physical office 4.
Okay, great. We're
investing out here, almost all of them.
Everyone, yeah.
20,
everyone.
25, more. Co-investing, even higher. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So if you're a founder, why should you how should you be gauging your investors? Is American better because you've just been doing this startup venture capital thing for decades longer?
It is
Should
almost
you be looking for an investor?
Yeah, no, it's this is a very personal experience. As a founder, you're letting investors buy a piece of your company. That's how you should think about it. So it has to be somebody that, of course, can help you. And you really should dig into that. And you should back channel like crazy, talk to former founders of the firm, no matter whether they were introduced to you or not, reach out, do a ton of back channeling, find out if they can actually help you and how, right? Some firms are really good at helping with hiring. Some people are really good at helping with product. Like, what do you think you need help with? But overarching all of that, do they share your values? Do you like them? If something goes horribly wrong, will you pick up the phone without hesitation to call them and ask for their help? Those are the things you got to look for. And so in that way, it is a very personal decision to make. And at the end of the day, we're all selling a commodity. You can get cash from anybody. There are more venture capital firms today than there were 5 years ago in Europe by an enormous magnitude. So meet people and trust your instincts around that and trust the references of people you respect. But after a certain point, that's going to be more important than a lot of things.
Yeah, if I had to make a bet, I would say that in the direction of travel is certainly that brand matters less and less, and personal connection, relationship fit matters more and more. I think certainly if I was betting 5 years from now, I think the winners in VC will not, they may well be the same as the winners today, but it won't be because they're like, oh, it's Sequoia. It will be because, these firms have found ways to scale their ability to build like really meaningful relationships with founders who believe that they're on their side and can help them succeed. And I think that, as much as the sort of like coming to Europe physically of American investors, which of course I welcome, I think the other big thing that's having a huge impact in the market is individual, formerly angel investors having very large amounts of capital at their disposal directly from LPs. There's some people call these solo GPs. There's lots of different terms used for them. But I think the fact that personal brand has been, because of the enormous amounts of capital that want to get into venture right now, has been able to be monetized by, well-known founders, well-known angel investors. That also means that like the institutional brands, I'm sure Juliet experiences this, have to fight harder and harder to sort of to win. And the days of sort of in Europe there being like 2 or 3 options at Series A, and like the partners in those firms could just sit back. I'm not sure they ever did, but just sit back and relax. I mean, that is long gone, and like it is fiercely competitive now, and that's got to be a great thing for founders.
It's also not just that, right? There's also more competition in the forms of capital that founders can get hold of, right? There's like revenue-based financing, another thing. There's like a startup a week doing that, and there's more debt funding. There's lots of different things. So do you think is the power of the VC going a bit this direction?
Power is a funny word. I think like it's VCs, I think, are acutely aware, both per individual. I mean, Juliet can comment on whether this is true, like personally and as firms, that they're only as good as their last deal, their last fund. Like the half-life of VC brand, I think, is shortening, and therefore, revenue-based financing, like other forms of, these are just one more thing that makes the job of a VC harder. I don't know if I would think of it in terms of power so much as sort of it's really just about it's always a question of like, how do we win? How do we stay relevant? Like, how do we be the right partners to the founders that we think are going to succeed? And I think it's really good for founders to be in a world where VCs have to wake up in the morning and think that, like, how do I be a better partner to founders? And maybe we're about to see, and we are seeing some correction, particularly at the later stages, in that being expressed purely through the lens of valuation. But I don't think it's going to change the fact that VCs are having to work harder than ever before to be the right partners to entrepreneurs.
And I hope that stays true, by the way. I think there's historically been a low bar for venture capitalists. I mean, I meet a lot of founders who look at the industry as if it has a bad rep. And as someone who's been in it for 7 years, that's not even that long of a time. It's it's tough to think about how low the bar is to be a good human being in our industry. And so from that perspective, I absolutely hope you're right, Matt. Completely hope you're right. And if I were a founder and I was thinking about the type of capital to take, I would ask a lot of questions because, Amy, you're right. For some companies, venture is not the way to go. Because for a venture investor, we want to see an enormous outcome, right? We'd rather you either 0 or 10x. We're not super excited by a lifestyle business that sells for $200 million on the way up, even though that amount of money could be life-changing for a founder. So you really do want to think, how big is this opportunity? Can I build a really big company in this space? If not, venture may not be the right answer. And that's perfectly fine. And so, yes, there is debt capital, revenue-based financing. To your point, there are lots of them, like the Wayfires, Clearbank, Outfund, et cetera. These companies, it's expensive money. Like, you really need to understand what the APR is on the dollar you're getting. So it's not to be taken lightly. But nevertheless, if you have a self-sustaining dollar in, $2 out marketing funnel, and your customer acquisition cost is predictable, then it could be a great source of funding for you, because then you're not taking on equity. So it is worth having conversations with people, honestly, about what is the type of business that I'm building, how big can it get, and what type of funding do I want? I think that's totally reasonable. But I think for many companies, venture is a phenomenal way to back a business. If you want to build something really big and you want firepower of the humans behind the firm to help you do that, it's like, I always try to say to the founders I work with, think of me as another team member, right? Like that's what it has to feel like at the beginning. And it's my responsibility to make sure you can take advantage of the entire GC machine. But you're right. It absolutely depends what funding is best for a company.
So there are some questions coming in, but please ask more questions, everyone. So there's one from Ayush, which is, what spaces other than Web3 are you excited to back? And I'm going to add on to that. If someone listening doesn't actually want to be a founder, but they want to join a startup really early, where do you reckon is a good spot to be in?
Oh my list is so long. Spending a lot of time with API first businesses. I love embedded software. I love to be the machine behind the machine. Spending a lot of time in dataware as well. People think like the big data movement is over and we're done, but it's actually gotten a lot harder and a lot worse. So actually building sustainable data infrastructure is still fascinating to me. And then if you're in Europe, taking advantage of the regulatory environment here is a very valuable thing to think about. So climate tech. I mean, one of our managing partner, Hemant, who invested in clean tech a decade ago and almost all of it went to zero, is the first person to tell you that now is a phenomenal time to try again. I mean, there's so much that has changed. And especially in Europe, where there are genuine regulatory frameworks to encourage businesses and individuals to behave differently. That's unique, right? That doesn't exist in the US right now. So lots of opportunities. Those are just a couple.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, we deliberately don't take, kind of space related. I don't mean like as in going to space, although we have invested in that as well. But we don't take sector-based view of investing. We take a purely talent-based view of investing. So we always say we want to be surprised by what great founders want to build. That said, I mean, if you look at our data on like what do incoming founders to Entrepreneur First say they want to work on, by far the biggest two categories right now are Web3, which was vetoed from discussion here. So ignoring that, second one by far is what Juliet said, is climate. Like, we just have a huge inbound talent flow into that. And I think it's worth saying, like, that encompasses such a broad range of things, like everything from, kind of quite light touch, software-based models, marketplaces for helping companies that want to achieve true net zero, for example, on one end, right through to ultra deep tech sort of new ways of doing, carbon capture and sequestration. So I think that is a space that again, I'd always hesitate to say we want to do more of, and we just know we're going to be doing a lot more of, because that's what the talent wants.
Cool. I've got a question from Nydia, which is, does anyone here invest in Black founders in the UK? And what challenges and innovations do you see in this area? Juliet, this one.
Oh, I love this question. We talk about it all the time internally, partly because GC is a a long history of a racial justice. I wouldn't say it's a program. It's frankly just a core value of ours. But we think about it a lot now that we're in Europe. Like, how do we actually build a proper strategy around POC here and investing in them and building out networks? There are a couple of extraordinary humans who have been doing this work much longer than we have. So Black Girl Fest, if you're both female and Black, that's an extraordinary place to learn and learn from some very talented founders themselves, but also a great network. And there's a group called Black Seed that not only invests, but also is an incubator accelerator of sorts. Cyril and Carl, who lead that, are visionaries, is the simplest way to put it, and also very realistic. And have conversations about the types of questions you're going to get asked if you're a Black founder versus if you're white or some other color, or if you've had experience before, or if you haven't. First-time founders who are also Black, you're going to face different levels of unconscious bias, and it's about finding an investor who's willing to talk about that and acknowledge it, because everybody has unconscious biases. That's societally structured that way, but it doesn't mean that you can't work around them. So I think there's more and more conversation happening in this space. We hope to be a deep part of that, but it's a day at a time.
There's also an angel network called Cornerstone, which invests in Black founders. There's also a guy called Andy Davis, who's a really active angel investor who backs Black founders. There's definitely more. If you go on Sifted, there are definitely some articles about this, Nydia. So I hope that's useful. Okay, classic question.
Very quickly adding, like, so many of these things it's not yet great, I would say, and I think we should start from that premise. But I genuinely think it's getting better, and I think a lot of the initiatives that you've mentioned, part of that. I'll give a small plug for Code First Girls, which is a nonprofit that Alice, my co-founder, and I started 8 years ago, which teaches young women to program free of charge. Now 60% non-white, the intake into Code First, and it's just an amazing community for future founders who want to upskill technically before doing that journey, or indeed anything else. But there is loads going on in this space, and like the energy and vision, as Juliet said, of the leaders in this space is really inspiring, and it is making a difference.
Is it though?
Yeah,
because
it is.
Investing into female founders, right, is
still
basically like flatline. Decade.
Well, it's true, but if you look at the pipeline, it is changing radically. Like, I really think that part of the problem, I mean, I'm not in any way trying to minimize the problem. The problem is vast and deep rooted. But I think we should acknowledge progress, because I think I don't want to discourage people from feeling that the things that they're doing are making a difference. And actually, what I would say is we see, for example, in absolute terms, the number of women applying to EF, for example, goes up and up and up. Now, it's true that the number of men applying does too. But the thing that I would say is that the power of communities, particularly on female founders, bubbling up at the sort of pre-seed level, it's so hard for me to imagine, given that these didn't exist 10 years ago, that 10 years from now we won't be seeing these come through. Because I think one of the things that is often forgotten is that most people, we had that long segment of this conversation about people starting companies straight out of uni. I think the real win for the ecosystem in Europe is now that we have huge tech companies that are throwing off talent who are starting companies after leaving. And actually, I think if you look at kind of senior female, technically or product-oriented employees in big, kind of decacorn, unicorn startups, that really has increased a lot. Now, unfortunately, that takes sort of 10 years to cycle through to Series A funded female founders, but it is happening. And I really wouldn't want anyone who's inspired to work on this as a problem to think, oh, we've tried everything and nothing works. I really don't think that's true. I think it's partly a question of ecosystem maturity.
Yeah. Nydia, I thought of one more. Google for Startups has a fund specifically to back Black founders, and it's on its second run right now. So check that out. Right. Classic question from Jamal. What are the key competencies you look for in founders before you decide to invest? I feel like we slightly touched on this earlier, but let's do the Juliet. What are the
Can you attract great talent was number one. Founder market fit. Why you? And why now? Do you have a compelling why now as well? Those are key. But again, these sorts of questions are going to be different at every stage, right? I'm thinking at the earliest stages. As you go forth, it's how have you professionally built an organization? How do you think about operational efficiency? How do you articulate your defensibility in this market? There are obviously a lot, but the top of the list.
I think for us, pre-company, we'd be looking for problem solving. Is this person just really, really good at solving problems? Skill, do they have something they're bringing to the table that they can be exceptional at, that can be the basis of a great company? Resilience, are they able to take the knocks that come inevitably in every single founder journey I've ever seen and still come through and have the energy and drive to continue? And are they willing to challenge the status quo? Like, is it something, are they willing to do something that could look foolish? Many great people who fit the first three don't actually have the last one, and that's what disqualifies them.
Cool. All right. I think we've got time for one more question from Daryl, which is curious to find out what's an example of a contrarian belief that you hold about something within VC.
Okay, I've got one, Amy. You wanted our spicy takes at the beginning.
Here we go.
I strongly suspect that a lot of people today who are sitting on really great looking track records in VC and think they're very, very smart will 2 years from now look like they were the beneficiary of 10 years of extremely expensive monetary policy and LPs that they needed to deploy enormous amounts of capital into VC. I think there is a ton of self-assurance in our industry today that is largely based on the ability of very large institutions to come in after VCs and mark up their positions. Some of those will turn out to be world-changing companies. A lot of them won't, and I think we are probably heading for quite a big shakeout where the skill lock entanglement gets disentangled very painfully before our eyes.
Interesting. Juliet?
I'm hoping this isn't going to be contrarian for very long because GC, we talk about this thing called responsible innovation a lot, which you can read about in Google General Catalyst Responsible Innovation. You can read some very, very thoughtful and well-articulated views that I certainly can't mimic now. But the general idea is that actually to make an enormous amount of money for our LPs, right, which is what venture capital funds do, we cannot invest in companies that are doing bad things for the world. And that's a very broad statement, but everything from vaping businesses to computer vision that will sell to CCTV cameras that are racial profiling, these are businesses that could make an enormous amount of money. But we genuinely believe that our firm will not exist 50 years from now if we back those types of companies. And we think that the firms that are not necessarily thinking about long-term responsibility to the world will fail.
Cool.
Can I ask a really spicy question then, Juliet? What was the best example of a venture-backed company that's made a ton of money for its investors that would fail this test?
That would fail that. What do you mean by fail? You mean
like a company that the people that backed it did incredibly well. Their LPs made out like bandits, but actually in the GC framework, it's like we just wouldn't do it, even though it would have made. Pardon?
Facebook.
Okay. Wow, that's a bold one. Good, love it.
Has made a lot of people a lot of money, and it's a tough cookie company to think about.
Love it.
Fab. Okay, I think that is about time. That's about all we have time for. Although I've just realized Daryl did actually ask me. I don't know if this is very contrarian, but I think that a lot of VCs should be banned from social media because a lot of their hot takes are not very hot and very self-serving. I'd like to see more female VCs be quite as vocal on social media because it definitely.
Don't encourage us. I don't even have a Twitter.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Please, obviously, check out GC's website, check out EF. Please read Sifted. We have lots of newsletters. Sign up to them, and I'm posting in the chat our careers page because we are hiring lots of different roles. If you're interested in working for probably not a business, let's be honest, that's going to 10x, but we can change the ecosystem in a different way via our reporting and that kind of thing. So yeah, please check out Sifted as well. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your sessions.